"So be it," said the Englishman. "But to return to these registers. True, this story has diverted our attention from them." "Excuse me." "Excuse you for what?" "For the story?" "By no means, it really seems to me very curious." "Yes, indeed." "So, sir, you wish to see all relating to the poor abbé, who really was gentleness itself?" "Yes, you will much oblige me. Go into my study here, and I will show it to you." And they both entered M. de Boville's study. Everything was here arranged in perfect order, each register had its number, each file of papers its place. The inspector begged the Englishman to seat himself in an armchair, and placed before him the register and documents relative to the Château d'If, giving him all the time he desired for the examination, while de Boville seated himself in a corner, and began to read his newspaper. The Englishman easily found the entries relative to the Abbé Faria, but it seemed that the history which the inspector had related interested him greatly, for after having perused the first documents he turned over the leaves until he reached the deposition respecting Edmond Dantes. There he found everything arranged in due order, the accusation, examination, Morel's petition, M. de Villefort's marginal notes. He folded up the accusation quietly, and put it as quietly in his pocket, read the examination, and saw that the name of Noirtier was not mentioned in it, perused, too, the application dated 10th of April, 1815, in which Morel, by the deputy procuror's advice, exaggerated with the best intentions, for Napoleon was then on the throne, the services Dantes had rendered to the imperial cause, services which Villefort's certificates rendered indispensable. Then he saw through the whole thing. This petition to Napoleon, kept back by Villefort, had become, under the Second Restoration, a terrible weapon against him in the hands of the king's attorney. He was no longer astonished when he searched on to find in the register this note, placed in a bracket against his name. Edmond Dantes, an inveterate Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from the island of Elba. To be kept in strict solitary confinement, and to be closely watched and guarded. Beneath these lines was written in another hand: See note above. Nothing can be done. He compared the writing in the bracket with the writing of the certificate placed beneath Morel's petition, and discovered that the note in the bracket was the same writing as the certificate, that is to say, was in Villefort's handwriting. As to the note which accompanied this, the Englishman understood that it might have been added by some inspector who had taken a momentary interest in Dante's situation, but who had, from the remarks we have quoted, found it impossible to give any effect to the interest he had felt. As we have said, the inspector, from discretion, and that he might not disturb the Abbé Faria's pupil in his researches, had seated himself in a corner, and was reading Le Drapeau Blanc. He did not see the Englishman fold up and place in his pocket the accusation written by Danglars under the arbor of La Réserve, and which had the postmark. Marseille, 27th February, delivery 6 o'clock p.m. But it must be said that if he had seen it, he attached so little importance to this scrap of paper, and so much importance to his 200,000 francs, that he would not have opposed whatever the Englishman might do, however irregular it might be. Thanks, said the latter, closing the register with a slam. I have all I want, now it is for me to perform my promise. Give me a simple assignment of your debt, acknowledge therein the receipt of the cash, and I will hand you over the money. He rose, gave his seat to M. de Baville, who took it without ceremony, and quickly drew up the required assignment, while the Englishman counted out the bank notes on the other side of the desk. Chapter 29. The House of Morel and Son. Anyone who had quitted Marseille a few years previously, well acquainted with the interior of Morel's warehouse, and had returned at this date, would have found a great change. Instead of that air of life, of comfort, and of happiness that permeates a flourishing and prosperous business establishment, instead of merry faces at the windows, busy clerks hurrying to and fro in the long corridors, instead of the court filled with bales of goods, re-echoing with the cries and the jokes of porters, one would have immediately perceived all aspect of sadness and gloom. Out of all the numerous clerks that used to fill the deserted corridor and the empty office, but two remained. One was a young man of 23 or 24, who was in love with M. Morel's daughter, and had remained with him in spite of the efforts of his friends to induce him to withdraw. The other was an old one-eyed cashier, called Cockleys, or Coque, a nickname given him by the young men who used to throng this vast now almost deserted beehive, and which had so completely replaced his real name that he would not, in all probability, have replied to anyone who addressed him by it. Cockleys remained in M. Morel's service, and a most singular change had taken place in his position. He had at the same time risen to the rank of cashier, and sunk to the rank of a servant. He was, however, the same Cockleys, good, patient, devoted, but inflexible on the subject of arithmetic, the only point on which he would have stood firm against the world, even against M. Morel, and strong in the multiplication table, which he had at his fingers' ends, no matter what scheme or what trap was laid to catch him. In the midst of the disasters that befell the house, Cockleys was the only one unmoved. But this did not arise from a want of affection, on the contrary, from a firm conviction. Like the rats that one by one forsake the doomed ship even before the vessel weighs anchor, so all the numerous clerks had by degrees deserted the office and the warehouse. Cockleys had seen them go without thinking of inquiring the cause of their departure. Everything was, as we have said, a question of arithmetic to Cockleys, and during 20 years he had always seen all payments made with such exactitude, that it seemed as impossible to him that the house should stop payment, as it would to a miller that the river that had so long turned his mill should cease to flow. Nothing had as yet occurred to shake Cockleys' belief. The last month's payment had been made with the most scrupulous exactitude. Cockleys had detected an overbalance of 14 sous in his cash, and the same evening he had brought them to M. Morel, who, with a melancholy smile, threw them into an almost empty drawer, saying, "Thanks, Cockleys, you are the pearl of cashiers." Cockleys went away perfectly happy, for this eulogium of M. Morel, himself the pearl of the honest men of Marseille, flattered him more than a present of 50 crowns. But since the end of the month M. Morel had passed many an anxious hour. In order to meet the payments then due, he had collected all his resources, and, fearing lest the report of his distress should get bruited abroad at Marseille when he was known to be reduced to such an extremity, he went to the Beaucaire fair to sell his wife's and daughter's jewels and a portion of his plate. By this means the end of the month was past, but his resources were now exhausted. Credit, owing to the reports afloat, was no longer to be had, and to meet the 100,000 francs due on the 10th of the present month, and the 100,000 francs due on the 15th of the next month to M. de Baville, M. Morel had, in reality, no hope but the return of the Pharaon, of whose departure he had learnt from a vessel which had weighed anchor at the same time, and which had already arrived in harbour. But this vessel which, like the Pharaon, came from Calcutta, had been in for a fortnight, while no intelligence had been received of the Pharaon. Such was the state of affairs when, the day after his interview with M. de Baville, the confidential clerk of the house of Thomson and French of Rome, presented himself at M. Morel's. Emmanuel received him. This young man was alarmed by the appearance of every new face, for every new face might be that of a new creditor, come in anxiety to question the head of the house. The young man, wishing to spare his employer the pain of this interview, questioned the newcomer, but the stranger declared that he had nothing to say to M. Emmanuel, and that his business was with M. Morel in person. Emmanuel sighed, and summoned Cocles. Cocles appeared, and the young man bade him conduct the stranger to M. Morel's apartment. Cocles went first, and the stranger followed him. On the staircase they met a beautiful girl of 16 or 17, who looked with anxiety at the stranger. M. Morel is in his room, is he not, Mademoiselle Julie? Said the cashier. Yes, I think so, at least, said the young girl hesitatingly. Go and see, Cocles, and if my father is there, announce this gentleman. It will be useless to announce me, mademoiselle, returned the Englishman. M. Morel does not know my name. This worthy gentleman has only to announce the confidential clerk of the house of Thomson and French of Rome, with whom your father does business. The young girl turned pale and continued to descend, while the stranger and Cockleys continued to mount the staircase. She entered the office where Emmanuel was, while Cockleys, by the aid of a key he possessed, opened a door in the corner of a landing place on the second staircase, conducted the stranger into an antechamber, opened a second door, which he closed behind him, and after having left the clerk of the house of Thomson and French alone, returned and signed to him that he could enter.